Uh, so good evening, everybody, the eminent participants and my faculty. I'll go again. We are going to talk about the present COVID pandemic that we are suffering. The whole world is upside down, no travel, nothing. People are dying. And all this discussion will revolve around how to fight this. Are we fighting well enough? And to discuss this, I have eminent faculty with me. So SARS-2 coronavirus is a new virus. As this virus is new, we are quite at a loss, and we all know that in city of Wuhan, some microbiologically undiagnosed pneumonia were found, and then subsequently it was found to be the coronavirus. Coronavirus does not cause usually disease in human beings, and we have had two outbreaks, that is MERS, that is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which killed 858, and then we had SARS in 2003, which also killed almost similar number. But this virus is absolutely different. It has killed 1.5 lakh of people by now, and up to 2 days back, it had killed 308 people in India. And these are the phases of epidemic. We actually need not go because we already spent some time, getting technical. I would like to draw your attention to this particular triangle, which says that majority of patients, that is 85% to 86% patients have mild disease. In fact, they may not have any symptoms. Then a smaller proportion would have moderate disease, and then 5%, as per the NEJM paper 2000, February 28th, 2020, 5% patients will go into the ICU, 2.3% would require mechanical ventilation, and 1.4% die. What it means is that despite giving mechanical ventilation, 2/3 of the patient would die, even with the best of the care. And it is more contagious than the diseases we have had, and it was thought to be spreading only by person to person, but we know that fomites are also the culprits. And I like to draw your attention to social distancing. And this particular slide shows that when you reduce the social exposure by 75%, then one person would infect about 30 people. And if you reduce social exposure to 50%, this number will go up. And if you do not do any social distancing, the one person would ultimately infect 406. So that's where we are today, that we don't have any vaccine. And everybody on television talks about flattening of curve, flattening of curve. We are looking at it. What it means is that essentially it means that number of cases should occur over a longer period of time instead of having a shorter period of time. Now, severity of illness, I've already described. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. So, symptoms. The frequently asked question on television when we go, can I discriminate between flu and corona infection? The answer is no. Sneezing, running nose, fatigue, cough, fever, sore throat, so on and so forth. You get worried when you become breathless. That is the time you realize. And there is also a thought process that there is something called happy desaturation. That means the person desaturates but doesn't feel so breathless about it. These are the characteristics, and ultimately there is multi-organ failure which causes death. And variety of treatments and non-invasive ventilation, we can keep on talking about it. I am not in favor of it because it causes aerosol generation. High flow nasal cannula and mechanical ventilation. Everything is being tried, and also the ECMO. The situation has become so bad in Italy that 2 patients are being ventilated with 1 ventilator. Then, instead of usual oronasal mask, the helmet is being used to minimize and this is a picture you can see where the situation has come where 1 ventilator is being used by 2 by using variety of valves. lot of new things are being tried, especially in Italy, like awake proning. That is, the patient is not intubated, but he is prone, and it was seen that the oxygenation becomes better, and it was seen that you can do awake proning up to the period of 6 hours or longer, and the oxygenation improves. Intubation becomes a big problem for the person who is intubating. So variety of things have been tried so that the healthcare workers are not affected. And it is said that everybody should have a video laryngoscope instead of the conventional laryngoscope. And people have even devised indigenous thing. Like you can see, this is box, transparent, indigenously made box with two holes. Not a big deal. But this has been devised and it is published none other than in New England Journal of Medicine to intubate a patient so that the the person who is intubating is not affected. We are looking at the indicators: ester, D-dimer, cardiac troponin, lymphocyte, C-reactive protein, and so on and so forth, so that we can prognosticate these patients and plan treatment accordingly. But so far, we have not failed. We have failed in this. I'll be shooting questions to my eminent panelist, and my first question comes to Dr. Dhruv Chaudhary. Is he around? Dr. Dhruv Chaudhary or Dr. Christopher?
Hi, sir.
You are there, Dhruv?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dhruv. So my first question to you is, you have been very closely involved with care of COVID patient. I know you are a nodal officer for Haryana. You have been following the 18 Italians which were admitted in Medanta. So what is the situation in India and what is the way forward?
You see, we are finding a very heterogeneous picture when you combine together, and when you split it or do it will be very different. And what we are finding, sir, is that obviously we are started moving on the steep curve. And you must have read the government of India also that if we probably would not have done the lockdown, numbers would have been enormous and we would not have been able to handle that. So the limited point I'm making is that some states have done very well. There are certain hotspots in the different states which are there. Hello, I'm audible, sir?
Yeah, but you can remove the mask for the time being.
I was sitting in the office and the people were around. So,
yeah.
and in Haryana, they made it mandatory now to have masks. So that's why I just kept it. But nevertheless, so what is important for us to remember is that we have able to manage, I must say, our healthcare system has worked very well. In terms of public health, we have able to take care of 3 waves. The first wave was from the China when the people came. Second was from the West. And third, which came little later, that also most of the states have handled it. We are having a couple of hotspots which are there, which is in Delhi, which is in Rajasthan, which also is coming up in Maharashtra in particular. Your Mumbai and Pune are the 2 ones which are the major hotspots which we are seeing. And in Madhya Pradesh, we had Indore, which was again had become the place. Kerala has started showing a downward trend with their active. So the things are a little heterogeneous. I was talking to my colleagues in Hyderabad, though it has been put into hotspots, but again, they are seeing a plateauing and down curve. In Haryana, we have been seeing that we have been beyond this. We have not seen much, except that there have been doubt along the borderlines of.
So what is the way forward, in your opinion?
Sir, the way forward is probably a lot of people are talking. I'm coming an indirect answer to you. Way forward is what has been to see it. And at the same time, I think the way forward is looking at the epidemiology. You have to follow the epidemiological pattern of the disease. And looking at it, picking up second, tertiary, or quaternary infections, you need to extend it a little further. And if I look at the total time period from the medical perspective I'm talking of, we already have more than is of there. So if you see the graph which is coming from the epidemiologically, it to be very effective, you need roughly 49 to 56 days. So I think the way forward is what we are doing, we need to have it. But at the same time, having said so, obviously there's a lot of political, there will be a lot of social, political, economic pressures actually to pick up that.
We'll talk about that. So let
So,
me,
so
thank you.
I think we
So while
need
I
to
was,
forward.
yeah, thank you very much. That was a, so I come to Dr. Nitin Arora, who is based in Birmingham. Nitin, uh, how is the current status of COVID in UK? And tell us about the strategy that you are following. Dr. Nitin. Is Dr. Nitin around?
Yes, sir. Dr.
Okay, if the Nitin is unable to come, is Dr. Brajesh Goyal around? Dr. Brajesh.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hi.
Dr. Nitin, you are.
Nitin, did you get my question?
Hello. Yes, I did. Yes. So,
Yes, so
Dr.
tell us.
Kilani, what we've got is within my trust, so we've got nearly 190 patients with COVID 19 that are intubated and ventilated in intensive care. Nationally, we've got nearly 4,000 patients that are ventilated, which is almost 100% of, should I call it, our peacetime ICU capacity. So we are at almost 100% of our normal ICU capacity with COVID patients. However, what we have done is in the last, because we had a few weeks of warning with China and then Italy, what we have managed to do is we have managed to expand our normal capacity by about 2.5 to 3 times. So currently, we are ventilating twice the number of patients we normally ever would.
Nitin, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but sorry,
Yeah,
I'm interrupting you. Tell me a holistic view, not only the critical care view of UK.
Okay, so the holistic view is that there are more than 12,000 deaths so far. The hospitals have stopped doing all elective surgery except for really life-saving emergency surgery. What we are, the whole hospital, so for instance, my hospital, out of 28 wards, 2 have been designated as non-COVID wards, everything else.
But what is being done? Sorry, I need to interrupt you. We know all the numbers, but what is being done?
Yes. Okay, so what is being done is we are doing aggressive management of the patients that present to ICU or present to hospital. We are practicing early intubation. We're doing some CPAP, but not a lot because our oxygen supply is a problem. We are trying to manage patients that are admitted to ICU in the best possible evidence-based medicine.
But what is being done to prevent the transmission?
Okay, so for the last 3.5 weeks, we have had aggressive social isolation, which is very, very similar to what India has had, except we started about a week before that. We have had very aggressive social isolation. Almost all businesses, almost all shops, everything except for essential services. So food, grocery stores, and essential services and hospitals. Everything else is closed.
Okay.
What we have is...
I'll come back to you for the management and the ICU. Let me come to Dr. Brajesh Goyal from New York. Brajesh, are you there? Dr. Brajesh. So if Dr. Brajesh is unable to come, I'll come to Dr. Anup. Dr. Anup from Calicut.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, doctor. You know, the first case was from Kerala and you have been able to control it. So just briefly tell us about how did you manage and what are you doing now?
So the first 3 cases were reported in Kerala. Like the first case was reported in Jan 30th. So what happened was in 2018, we had a Nipah outbreak in Kerala. And again, 2019 also there was 1 case. So from 2018 onwards, the healthcare system is well tuned to these sort of patients, like contact tracing, isolating them. And again, the infection control practices were also like improved after the Nipah outbreak. And again, we had 1 more chance in 2019. So the moment we got an information that the outbreak has happened in China, so from that time onwards, the healthcare system was like anticipating the patients here. So almost by Jan 20th, we have started all the systems here. So all the people who are coming back from China were quarantined. So that period itself, we had 3,500 persons, mainly medical students, returning from Hubei and other parts of China. So from the quarantine patients on, from the quarantined persons only, we identified 3 persons, and from that 3 there were no secondary spread at all, and all these persons improved also. So after that again we were very vigilant. Then actually during this next March first week, we got one family who came back from Italy. In fact, they didn't.
Sorry, I'll have to cut you down there. So basically contact tracing. What about the testing facilities?
Testing facility, initially we had only one center by like NIV. Now we have enough centers. Even the testing wise, I think today we have tested almost 16,000 plus here in Kerala. Now what we have started is like we are trying to get the rapid antibody kit and the point of care PCR test like Gene Expert and the TrueNat we are like deploying in many parts of the state.
So, all right, Anup, I'll come back to you. I come to
Anup, I just wanted to ask one question to Anup. Have you?
Anup, segment, Dhruv, this will kill the system. We won't be able to finish.
Okay.
We'll come back to that discussion again. So, I come to Dr. Ashit Hegde. Ashit, are you there?
Yes, of course.
Ashit, good evening to you. And you have a busy emergency, in Hinduja. Hinduja has treated so many cases. And how do you triage these patients given the fact that symptoms and signs of COVID are non-specific? So in a busy emergency, I've seen that in Hinduja.
Fortunately, we have had a good engineering department which has created a kind of a shed just outside the hospital, which has become the triage area. It is negative pressure and it's a triage area. And fortunately for us, we have another building across the road, which is not centrally air conditioned, and that has become a COVID designated building. So at entry, everybody is sort of triaged, and only patients who don't have any risk factors and have no respiratory symptoms and no fever whatsoever are allowed entry into the main building. Everybody else goes through the triage. In the triage, there's a resident doctor in full protective gear, and then they're divided into low risk COVID suspects. Of course, COVID positive automatically go to the COVID building. Low risk are admitted to either the ICU, or separate ICU designated to them, or to the low risk floor. For COVID suspects, at the moment, the municipal corporation has said that we should not mingle COVID suspects with COVID positive. Until now, we have not had an area where we could keep COVID suspects, but next week we will also have that area. Until now, COVID suspects are transferred to a COVID designated hospital like Seven Hills or Nanavati. But next week we will have a separate area where we will keep COVID suspects. So we got 3 different levels.
So you don't have COVID patient till now, or
No,
my
COVID,
question next.
COVID positive we have.
Okay, so how do you transfer them? Is there a separate corridor that you have made, or they go with the other patients?
The transfer is in full gear. They have a N95 mask, they have the goggles, they have the gloves, and they have a gown. And after they are transported, the trolley or the ambulance or whatever is used for transport is cleaned, and even the lift in which they use to transport is unoperational for half an hour. It's completely clean. Nobody can use the lift for half an hour. It's completely surface cleaned, and that's how we sort of make sure.
So you are taking all the precautions in shifting. So is Dr. Christopher there? Thank you, Ashit. I'll come back to you. Is Dr. Christopher there?
Yes.
Oh, welcome. We have been waiting for you. So thank you so much. I introduced you. You were not there, our president. So what is your assessment of the global scenario? Where do you see the world going?
Yeah. Well, I think
we already discussed the Indian scenario.
Right. I think starting with China, they went through this rapid peaking, disaster, and then they took radical measures that almost no other country may be able to take, and they managed to contain it and bring down extraordinary measures. They also were able to ramp up their capacities, and they did a great job. Then it moved on to other Asian countries. Some of them did very well. Singapore, South Korea, and I think their forte was the ability to test a lot of people. And then Europe, unfortunately, didn't do too well, except perhaps Germany, Iceland, Italy and Spain didn't do well at all. France and UK are also struggling. So as I see it, in every place it follows a typical epidemic kind of a curve. And now we are at the beginning of that curve. We are just beginning to rise. And my feeling is that this is going to take off. And I think we were timely in imposing lockdowns, in that we arrested the rise at a point where we are able to cope. Having said that, when we release the lockdown, we will have a rebound, because there is steady increase despite lockdown now for 3 weeks.
So, can I stop you here and ask you a question? Do you think we are close to community transmission?
No, not close to. I personally think we are into community transmission long ago. There was an ICMR study which said that with data looking back, by around 22nd of March, we were already in community transfer. Anecdotally, we had a patient having a tea shop opposite to our hospital who died in a short span. And he has absolutely no travel or contact with anybody. There are several anecdotal cases all over.
Everybody has that kind of. So, Christopher, I have another question. I know CMC with a busy OPD, giving absolutely service to the humanity. So, how you are managing your OPD in the era of COVID? Is it because you are a head of pulmonary medicine?
So it was a challenge. It remains a challenge still, especially as you said, I'll start with my area. Like you, our problem is which of the chronic patients who exacerbate is a COVID suspect, is not. From our point of view, almost every exacerbation should be construed as COVID suspect unless proved otherwise. How do you manage non-invasive ventilation? Do you ever consider giving, or do you screen first and then give? So we have been through all these challenging situations, and finally we have drawn up some policy. And how do you do bronchoscopy? Whether you do at all?
No, just concentrate on OPD. We're talking about procedures later.
Right.
How do you manage OPD?
Right. So OPD, as was said in Hinduja, we have a triage at the entrances where they screen off people and send them to the fever clinic. And we have another layer of filter at our OPD before the doctor, as soon as the patient goes. And again, if the patient fails screening, they go back, send back to fever clinic. So this is how we try to reduce the patients who should not be in the regular OPD because they could have COVID.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. I'll come back to you again as the discussion flows. Now I come to the microbiologist, the most important person in the diagnosis and management of Dr. Sherwal. Are you around? Dr. B.L. Sherwal?
Yeah, Dr. Sherwal, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Yes,
Dr. Sherwal,
please.
Good evening, Dr. Sherwal. So, Dr. Sherwal has two roles. One is the eminent microbiologist, one of the senior most, and also is the administrator, and Rajiv Gandhi Super Specialty Hospital has been designated as COVID hospital, and he has promised to give 200 ventilator beds. I was part of that meeting which was looking into the preparedness of Delhi for COVID outbreak. So now I'm asking you a question, you as a microbiologist. Tell us some special things about RT-PCR. It's a sacrosanct test for, are there any difficulties in taking sample? Is the sensitivity too high or too low? Specificity is too high or too low?
No, definitely, as we all know that for testing, the most important thing is collection of the specimen. And, it is not in the control of the microbiologist. We always say as a microbiologist, good specimen is the key to diagnosis. We always say that garbage in, garbage out. If you will not give the proper sample, you will not be able to. So the doctor who is going to collect the specimen and then going to transport the specimen, that is very, very important. So, ideally, an ENT specialist or a postgraduate should be, there available in the.
So that's fine.
But
so
it is not possible. Then we need.
Dr. Is the nasopharyngeal better, or the throat swab is better, or?
If there is a choice between the two, nasopharyngeal is better.
Better. Okay. So you always have a choice of taking nasopharyngeal swab and the transportation. So what is the sensitivity of this test?
Yeah, basically when we talk about the RT-PCR, there are various kits now available. Now the stock is a problem. But when we talk about the how come, we are seeing that one test is positive, one test then again negative, or even another test is positive. So because when we are finding some kits, they are saying that sensitivity is hardly 90%. It is not even 95%. So we are stuck
90%.
with that. It is around 90%. But some of the kits are now coming up which are showing that it is raising to 95%. And as far as specificity is concerned, now it does not matter here, but still, when we label anybody as a COVID positive, psychologically it is important. So for that matter, specificity is good. That is 100%, almost 100%.
100%. So it's a very good information. My microbiologists have different views. Some say it's only sensitivity is only 65%. If the 90% sensitivity is there, that is why it is always said before declaring a person COVID negative, you should do 2 tests 24 hours apart to say it is true negative. But if it is positive, then it becomes true positive. The other question to you is, a lot of news is coming about this serology test, antibody test, point of care test. It will come as if it will make a sea change in management of COVID. Tell us about it. When does it become positive? What is the sensitivity and what is the specificity?
No, definitely. We all know that, for management, testing time is important. It is turnaround time. How fast we can give the result, how fast we can, alert the clinician that this is the diagnosis, and so that they can start the treatment. Here also we are trying our best that we should get some tests which can be called or qualified as a point of care test. So there are different tests which have been tried, but frankly speaking, not much success is there. We have various tests which say that antigen spot test, which we are detecting the protein, viral protein in the nasal sample, but it has been found a very low sensitivity, hardly 30 to 60%, maybe not even more than that. So that is also a problem. Then when we talk about the antibody testing in a disease like COVID, because we want to test it as soon as possible. But when we say antibodies, minimum 1 week is required when the antibodies detectable.
So this is 1 week from the getting the infection or starting the illness?
No, it is from the infection, and then we can detect if a small number of antibodies do appear on 5th day, but detectable level usually appear on the 2nd day of the.
So your point is very well taken. Everybody should understand that is point of care test, as it is called, because it gives the result in less than an hour. Some people say 5 to 13 minutes, but the test won't not be generally positive before 7th day of acquiring infection. Number one, the sensitivity is very low and specificity is also not very high.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
But recently ICMR has given approval for a test which is we are doing for tuberculosis. Actually, it is a TrueNet test. Workstation is there, so it is being used in peripheral or district level also. It is very easy to operate.
No, it is easy to do.
So
but,
it is easy.
But COVID is a disease which person starts transmitting even before having symptoms. So it cannot be used for case detection. It can be used for finding out as to whether person is immune or person has, person should be in illness for at least 3 days before it becomes positive. Am I right in saying that?
To some extent, basically, but as far as this is a good test for screening. So we can go and see and we can get the result within an hour, and a large number of, say, 15 to 20 sample can be done in one run. Sometime it can be more than 30. So that way it is going to be a very helpful in.
So it doesn't require much of expertise. It is not so expensive. So I come to our radiologist, Dr. Mahajan. Dr. Mahajan, are you there? Dr. Mahajan.
I'm here, sir.
Dr. Mahajan has recently published a meta-analysis, and pneumonia is the one which occurs and which kills a person. So what is the role of a X-ray or CT scan in these patients?
And sir, we have to take it based on symptoms. One is a patient who comes with hardly any symptoms or minor symptoms to a fever clinic or to the OPD. And there actually, if the symptoms are very less, probably radiology has no role to play at this stage. And unfortunately, what is happening, each and every patient who comes with fever and some little sore throat or cough is being sent to the radiology department. So that, I would say, is something which needs to be avoided.
So what about CT then? What about CT scan?
Even in the early stage may be negative. And in any case, CT is not to be used for diagnosing COVID. You know, that was done in the early, days in Wuhan when they didn't have enough RT-PCR tests available, and it was taking 7 days to get the report. So that's when they used CT at that point of time. But around the third week of February, they very categorically said that this is not to diagnose COVID-19.
So how does it prognosticate in a serious patient?
Yes,
the CT scan?
In a serious patient, it does prognosticate. In fact, it can even to some extent determine whether a patient is going to deteriorate and require assisted ventilation or endotracheal go on a ventilator. And that is based on, the extent of disease that you see. And also it has been found that one poor prognostic sign is dilatation of the pulmonary vessels near the lesions. So,
so Dr. Mahajan, I have another question for you.
Yes.
You know, the ultrasound everybody is using now, but with the COVID thing, is there any reservation on the part of radiologists to do ultrasound because they don't touch the patient?
Well, sir, where it is required, it should definitely be done. But I think its role is being overemphasized. At least, we see amongst the Indian College of Radiology and the chest radiology, they somehow tend to overemphasize the role. When portable X-ray is available and you will have a dedicated machine lying within the ICU, for these patients, I think that would suffice unless there is some real reason why you want to use, this technology. It can be useful, it should be used, but overemphasis on its use, I think, is because ultimately you have to do it in multiple positions, you have to move the patient, so your contact with the patient is for that much longer. So if it is such a sick patient, probably it may be, in that particular case, it may be worth doing a CT scan if it is going to change the way you're going to manage
it. Thank you. It was the words of wisdom. So, Dr. Brijesh, are you there? We missed you at the beginning of the discussion. Tell us about New York. Everybody is horrified. So, as an ID specialist, how do you see the situation? And what has gone wrong and what can be done? In 2 minutes, if you can brief us.
Well, as everyone knows, the United States, 1/3 of the cases are in New York. Is around, around 20,000, and there's a lot of deaths, around 12,000. And the curve peak is, I think, over. Since last 3 days, we are having deaths around 700. And usually it was up to 800, so they are not going up. The admissions are less than the discharges in the city, and also I'm in Nassau and Suffolk, that's the Long Island suburb of the New York City. There also, the peak is also flattening now, the curve. And then admissions are also less and deaths are almost not going up, So I take care of the residents who are elderly at present, and when they started, and there was a lot of, because they were not distancing them. Now, after they find out, they put them in the rooms, and that has cut down, but it still I would say there was a lot of deaths, and which was, I would say, at least 10-20% of my elderly patients are already died. But there was started in the beginning, but another friend of infectious disease, we started on those patients on doxycycline and hydroxychloroquine. So we started off 56 patients, 2 of them died, and 10 was admitted to the hospital. Rest was recovered, which was good,
Yeah, that's very interesting. Doxycycline as a drug. We are coming to the treatment, and I'll just get back to you. It's a pleasure having you. Now I come to Dr. Joseph. Are you there, Dr. Joseph?
Yes, sir.
I have a lot of questions. Yeah, I have a lot of questions to ask you. Some of them will be difficult. So WHO says testing. In that context, what are the challenges that you face as a quality in charge, and availability and the numbers of cases you get at CMC?
Sir, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer this. Probably Dr. DJ can throw better light on this question.
Okay, I'll ask you.
Directly involved with testing. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll ask you another question. How do you plan your nursing care in COVID wards and ICU, and how do you rotate them?
Yeah. Sir, I will talk from different perspective, being the Secretary General of CAHO, which is the
Hello. Hello, I can't hear you.
The risk and also to maximize the usage during the work hours that they are with us. Now, there are various things available across the globe. Short shift of about 4 hours, or you go to 6 hours, 8 hours, or 12-hour shift. Now, what is proven to be effective is either 6 hours or 12 hours, because you have to conserve your PPE as well. Now, when you have 8-hour shift, you need to give them a break in the middle, so they have to doff and come out. When they compromise on doffing, they end up being infected. So it is best to go with 6 hours or 12-hour shifts, and then have them for 7 days a week working, and then give them 14 days off. Either you keep them in a hostel or you send them back home with strict, measures to protect themselves. Now we have to rationalize and look at the usage of the PPE, because that's something which has become very precious. So, the aspect of donning and doffing has to be taken very, very strictly. Particularly the supervision of the donning, we take it very lightly. You wear the surgical scrub and you don't even tie the back ends. So you need to be extremely cautious about protecting the staff, about rationing the PPE. So in my opinion, I feel 6-hour shift or 12 hours shift for about 7 days would be ideal. Some hospitals have gone to the extent of even providing diapers to the healthcare workers, so that you minimize the break taken in the middle. So
that seems to be a great idea. Yeah, and then you can put the people on duty for longer hours, maybe 12 hours, and that's PPE is very important. And you already answered my second question, that how do you protect the health workers and other patients from? So how do you segregate these patients?
Yeah,
COVID suspect and
yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, sir, that's extremely important that you designate a block or a particular floor for such patients. Now, previously we were all putting all the patients together, but now it's very clear that you have to keep suspects in single rooms, because they could turn out to be positive or negative. If you try and cohort the suspects, you are in greater trouble. So basically the suspects in one area, then patients with mild illness in another area, and of course those requiring ventilation and aggressive management will need to move to the ICU. So the management of this entire thing has to be cumulatively taken care, so that the flow of the patients, dedicated lift for patient movement, for staff movement, the cleaning of these areas, the surfaces, the fomites, and also to try and see that you don't expose your healthcare workers to the maximum. So you'll have to enable technology to these areas. You don't have to use the concept of doctors and nurses walking in and out of these wards and also into the rooms, which is the normal case that you tend to go and give them the medications. It's best that you don't, ask them to take the medicines on time, phone up and tell them it's time for your medicines, so that you don't basically expose your healthcare workers more frequently to these patients. So you have to cut down the encounter to the minimum. References, all those will need to be taken care very carefully.
Are your all healthcare workers working or getting hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis?
Sir, we have left it to the discretion of the healthcare workers. We have put our ED, our ICU, and our direct intensivists and ID professionals, we've given them the option with consent. So if they feel they want to take, they can go ahead and take. Maybe Dr. DJ can add on to that. I presume that not many of them have actually taken the HCQ. Some of them have opted for it. So it's up to them. It's explained to them. The training is provided to them. They are counseled. So it's up to them to take the call on HCQ, but it's available.
So another question for you, Dr. Joseph, is
yes, sir.
What is the strategy to ensure that no infected staff be working in the hospital? That's a difficult thing to do.
It is.
How do you?
So, yeah,
you are the quality in charge.
Yeah.
So,
what we do is we keep talking to the staff. So we check with them if they are symptomatic. If they are very stressed out also, we actually give them off. So actually it is just a way of talking to them and finding out if they are, symptomatic or, so generally it is this 7 days thing that works, sir. You will have to keep them for 7 days and keep rotating them so that you are not really exposing them, and you need to talk to them. You need to constantly be talking to them.
but
So
did
the
you
goal
have
of the-
somebody? Sorry, I am interrupting you. Did you have some staff people becoming positive? Positive?
Not positive as yet, but some of them have been exposed. So we have actually quarantined them. So we have separate areas where we have quarantine for staff available, and we support them. We provide them food. Everything is provided to them. We really take care of them so that.
But do you think there's a wisdom in testing them even if they don't have symptoms?
Sir, you test them today. What if they get exposed tomorrow and day after? So I think that may not be the right thing to go ahead, particularly in organizations like ours, where we employ about 10,500 people. You start testing the doctors, the housekeeping will come and stand. So I don't know whether that's the way forward. Maybe it will become like a screening eventually. But at the moment, I don't know if that should be really encouraged.
But ideally, in the ideal world, which nobody has probably in today's, it is said that all the patients who are quarantined or supposed to be exposed should be tested on 5th to 7th day and again retested on 14th day to declare that actually because there's a funny disease where asymptomatic people are also have a potential to transmit also. So my next question is to you and Dr. Anup Kumar. Now we have just had an introduction to which probably known to everybody. Now we are going to discuss things which are a little contentious. And one of the contentious is, Dr. Anup, are you there? Dr. Anup.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yes. Anup, so do you think that there should be COVID testing before all routine procedures being done in the hospital in India?
Sir, that depends on the area. Like I'm working in the Calicut now. We don't have any community spread in this area. So I don't recommend doing routine COVID test for all patients who are undergoing surgery. But if they are having respiratory symptoms or having any
No. We are talking about person going undergoing upper GI endoscopy, person going cholecystectomy. If he has respiratory symptoms, there are no questions about it. But he doesn't. He going for a knee replacement. Anesthetist says that he is refusing to intubate the patient unless you show him that he is COVID negative. So, what is your take on that?
So that depends on the area. You will have to decide if there is a significant, as Dr. Joseph was mentioning, if there is that area is having a community spread, obviously we will have to do that. But if like you are from an area where there is no evidence of community spread, there is no point in doing that.
Dr. Joseph, your
Yeah,
opinion on that?
I tend to disagree. Being the wife of a neurosurgeon, I would say yes, go ahead, test all the patients who are going to be taken on an elective
There is a
measure.
bias. There is a bias in your utterances.
And
but
also, sir, we are seeing the
you are
doctors in
biased.
and out. Yeah, anesthetists, as you rightly said, everybody is apprehensive and every patient is symptomatic if you look at it. So today, yeah, so today actually we are going to be now having a LSES on a COVID positive mother in the next 1 hour. Now there are every patient who's coming in for antenatal checkup seems symptomatic. So how much can you expose your healthcare workers, particularly anesthetists and the surgeons? I think it's important to do that, sir. And I have got 2 circulars, one from it's Gangaram's hospital and one from some other hospital in Delhi, which is clearly put down in writing for all elective surgeries to go in for COVID testing.
There was a New England Journal of Medicine yesterday or day before yesterday. There was a write-up from New York saying that all the patients undergoing delivery should undergo COVID testing. So it's not a family bias, what you are saying. So whenever there's something contentious, I bring Dhruv in. Dhruv, are you there? Dhruv Chaudhary.
Yes, sir.
Batao, what is your take on this?
On what, sir, exactly?
Exactly, whether all patients undergoing procedures, routine procedures, be it endoscopy or cholecystectomy or knee replacement, under general anesthesia should undergo a COVID test before surgery.
Facing this problem every day. In fact, this has created one of the biggest problems for us in managing these cases. And practically the surgeons, the gynecologists, orthopedicians, they are on my blood actually. They're after my life. Now there are no real answers to it. So what we have been looking at it is that, and probably what I have been trying to do and tell them is that we need to do a good history. What I am realizing is a good history taking is not there. One, that is one very big problem, because when we started looking at tracing backwards, 90% of the patient you were able to trace it out, that there has been some communication or something like that. Is one part which I want to say. So they need to put specific questions in their protocols or checklists to be sure about it. One. Secondly, I have been trying to tell them, and I think quality control people which have been there with us, Dr. Lulu and all, etc., will agree that RT-PCR first week it is fine, second, third week you can't pick up. Therefore, as of now, even if I do a RT-PCR, I do not have a guarantee that the person is not having an asymptomatic carrier, and we may miss a number of patients. So that is what we are trying to tell surgeons too.
What is your verdict on that?
My verdict is it has to be on case-to-case basis, sir. It cannot be blanket right now, at least in Haryana, I can say so, because we have done 2,600 tests, out of which 96 are positive. Out of these 96, from one particular area, 80 are positive. Therefore, we have to be...
No, Dhruv, sorry, let me interrupt you. You are telling what is right. But anesthetists are saying, no, we won't intubate a patient unless you show us a COVID negative. It is true that every test has got a sensitivity and specificity.
Sir, for
Any
that,
of the panelists...
Yeah, so sir, for that, what we have done is, looking at it for anesthesiologists, we are trying to, like we have procured video laryngoscopes A, we have also created those cabins too, and we are telling all of them to use N95 mask as a part of protection. But contention is, along with anesthesiologists, is your surgical colleagues. And whether we like or dislike it, practically every surgeon is worth having the money in the corporate. They've all taken and procured their own PPE, because a couple of the cases had come up. But when they, again, I'm coming back, it's a risk assessment, which is the key, which unfortunately we are not doing it.
So I bring it, any panelists want to say something? This is a...
May I speak, Dr. Kalani?
Yes, please.
This problem also, I mean, two things. One thing that we have tried to do is, because, like you said, anesthetists obviously should take universal precautions, because it's impossible to. So we say that anesthetists should assume that every patient is positive unless proven otherwise, as Dhruv said. The second thing, like you said, surgeons are insisting on screening. So the main issue really is the cost. So what we are trying to do in our hospital is to do group screening, because these are likely to be mostly negative, the low risk patients. So we are trying to do group screening, 6 patients at a time. So the cost comes down by 1/6. So that is one way we are trying to sort of, the main issue. Otherwise, they're paying 4,500
Yes.
for a test. We are doing group screening.
Sir, here probably I think rapid test may be having some role to play once they will come up in terms of, it's like something we talked about HIV people, everybody got it, hepatitis B. So the antibody testing in some short of time probably will be, in the shorter point of time, will be one of those things which probably I'm proposing it can be of a help to us, because there you can see IgM, IgG, whether they are present or negative. If they are negative, you can be reasonably certain it's still. And if they are positive, I would like to look at it as an IgM or IgG. If it is alone IgM which is coming positive, then probably it is an active. I would like to postpone it. But if I am getting a significant titers of G, probably I will see that unlikely it is there, and then we will move it. So that probably may help us in prioritizing or triaging the cases.
Dr. Kilani, this is Harsh Mahajan, if I may come in. Dr. Kilani, may I come in? So I just wanted to say a couple of things. At the moment, there is no contention that any aerosolizing procedure involving aerosolization definitely requires screening. I would say bronchoscopy and any surgery which is in that capacity. Second, I want to say one thing anecdotal. There was a surgeon, cardiothoracic surgeon, who caught COVID from a patient he operated. Number three, objective published literature. There was a study where in Wuhan, they looked at patients who underwent surgery, but at the time they underwent surgery, they did not know that they were COVID positive. They looked at the outcomes. 45% required intubation post-operatively, and 25% died. So if this is the high rate of intubations and death in this cohort, I foresee a time when every patient going through a major procedure will have a COVID test before surgery.
Dr. Christopher, I will interrupt here because what you are saying is fine, but Wuhan was the epicenter. Is today somebody wants to say that whether I would like to do it in Mumbai, probably, or let's say in certain Indore, I may agree with you. That may not be true in your Christian Medical College. They may not be true in Rohtak. That may not be true. So we have to have a local epidemiology in account. Otherwise, you see the amount of load which will go into the labs. It's going to be enormous. That's the most important point again is in epidemiology. I won't say it is 100% foolproof, but it will give you a fair amount of an idea.
The epidemiology will change very rapidly.
See, that I agree.
Yeah, okay.
That you look at the
I am the moderator. I am the moderator, so please listen to me. This issue is, we have discussed enough because there are several other issues ahead. So thank you very much. And Dr. Christopher, your words of wisdom and the data are very alarming and very enlightening. Thank you very much. Now, next question is to Dr. Dhruv Chaudhary and Dr. Joseph both. And it's not hypothetical question. The question is, in the event of increase in number of cases as has happened in Italy or United States, should all doctors from all the specialties be involved in the care of COVID patients as has been done in other countries, like cardiologists being put in the ICU or gastroenterologist, or for that matter, another, all are MBBS doctors. So is it a reasonable idea in case that situation comes?
Already we are doing it, sir. So what we have done is, already we have done it. If you see it, ministry has very clearly divided this group into 6 groups. You have A, B, C, D, E, and F. F is an intern. F are the people who belong to the preclinical and paraclinical department. And rest are the clinical department.
Dhruv, please listen to me.
I have heard your thing.
Qualified cardiologist, call about, he's a cardiologist or a gastroenterologist. Dr. Brijesh is there. He told me that his son, who is a cardiologist, has been put to look after COVID patients. That's how
Sir, I was answering your question. That is why I'm coming to it. Well, they very clearly required the 5 groups of people, department, like my department, your department, anesthesia, emergency medicine, internal medicine. Those who are running the department intensive care units, they are trying to put them ahead. Now that's a separate issue. We are putting cardiology, gastroenterology. A lot of places you will see the gastroenterologists are running ICUs. So what they are saying is, if they have an exposure to it, and here what is important is, depending upon it, where you want to put them in. What we have done is, these people have been attended to the screening. Whereas it is coming to the intensive care units, we are having anesthesia, pulmonary critical care medicine, and a support from internal medicine because we have an exposure to ICU or they have the ventilators with them. So that way we are working it out. And the another thing, what we have done in the cases of nurses is one trained nurse, one untrained. So we are using this period to train them, A, and B, acclimatize to that thing if you want to, 2. And 3, at the same time, it is the senior most person or the experienced person. They are supervising everything. Therefore, probably is that your question will be important in terms of intensive care. But nevertheless, every specialty has to take care of it. And if God forbid what happens in New York or what has happened in Wuhan, we may be still at the front line, but they will be our support base.
Okay, so let me ask the quality administrator, Dr. Joseph.
Yeah. Sir, I completely agree with Dr. Dhruva on this, because there's a beautiful guideline that has come from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare that is specific to basically the postgraduates and the nursing students. But if you extrapolate that, that is what the globe has done. As he rightly said, 6 categories, A, B, C, D, E, and F. So F category is basically your interns. And then the level of care, level A, B, and C, A is the screening area. So if you look at the screening area, that's where your categories E, D, and all of those go. So you need to formalize this way ahead of time. You can't do it when the catastrophe, the crisis is going on. So this is where the hospital preparedness comes into play.
All right. So let me, Brajesh, what is being done in New York? You know, you are the most experienced. What is your view on this?
But they are not doing any surgeries, you know, the elective surgeries at all. And and they are rotating, you know, all the consultants to the intensive care unit. And but yes, there is a supervisor, you know, someone is supervising them, but they are all rotated, and they are giving like 3 days in a week and then 3 days, and now, like you said, every week they rotate like every 3 days or so.
All right.
They are
Thank you,
using
Brajesh.
Can I say something here, Dr. Kilani?
Sure, please. Yeah.
Right.
Please.
So about a month ago, when it became clear that we were going to be hit really hard, what we did was we started a program of retraining for our pulmonology consultants that some of whom don't regularly do intensive care, some of our cardiologists, some of our thoracic surgeons, and some of our vascular surgeons, including consultants and registrars. And so they have been supernumerary on our unit for almost a month. And currently they are actually doing duties over there. Also, what we did was we stopped all elective operating a month ago, and we trained up our theater nurses and some ward nurses to come and do training sessions on intensive care. And currently, normally we run a 1-to-1 intensive care nurse to patient ratio. Currently, what we have is we have 1 intensive care nurse for 3 patients with 2 theater nurses or anesthetic nurses to help them. So, and all of them have had months or so to get used to this. Also, we've done other things like get orthopedic physios into working on intensive care as respiratory physios, because all of them have done respiratory physio in the past. It's just that over the last few years, they've specialized in orthopedics, and they are all now doing respiratory physio with us. And it's all working.
Thank you from your side, absolutely from the ground level. Now I have another question, which is on for Dhruv. He's always there, and then Dr. Sherwal. Dr. Sherwal, not as a microbiologist, but as a director of the super specialty Rajiv Gandhi Super Specialty Hospital, which has been earmarked for COVID hospital with 400 beds, and he has promised us that he will give 200 ICU beds. So the number of cases are rising. We hope we don't reach where other countries are. However, we should be prepared for that. In view of that, Dr. Sherwal, how you have prepared your hospital? Can you tell us?
Thank you, Dr. Gilani. Before I go there, actually, because there was discussion regarding the utilization of the resource which you have. So I agree that, as you know, that we are a total super specialty hospital. So we have, you'll be surprised that nodal officer for our hospital is a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he was not asked, but he volunteered. And, I have to ask him, please, take care of yourself. and he said, no, I'm all right, I'm all right. So that is really heartening to see people who are working hard, and they are all three cardiologists, cardiothoracic surgeon are put into there, and they are doing duty. Same way, because we are now COVID hospital, so we have utilized the services of the GI surgeon, gastroenterologist, and neurosurgeon, and critical care, pulmonary medicine. Everyone has been taken into the COVID area. So they are all working, and everyone is actively, as of now, there is no problem as far as organizing.
So now answer my
Coming
question.
Yeah, coming to the question, which that, and I feel proud that when things started working in Delhi, our hospital was the first to designated as a COVID hospital, and I'm really thankful to particularly Dr. Kilani and other team member who was there to help us for the preparedness of in the hospital work. And I'm also thankful to the bureaucrats and the politicians who have helped me. Reason being that we were only 200 bedded hospital, and we were asked to start 500 bed hospital, and we were not having even the bed. So on a war footing, we have to prepare ourselves, and with the discussion of the committee, which you were there, Dr. Tempe was there, and Dr. Sareen has always helped us. So we were able to procure the bed. We were able to procure the ventilator, whatever we have put into there. Then we have to see what are the oxygen point there, BiPAP is there. So all the way, we have to done within a span of 15 days. So I'm really glad that we are now, happily placed. To start with, we were having only 13 ventilators, and now we are having around 40 ventilators, and 20 more are coming from CPA. So around 60 ventilators now we have. But at the same time, we have around 200 ventilators points, and all beds which we have are having the oxygen points. And now policy has also been changed in Delhi. I'm basically asked to shift all the mild and mild symptomatic patient out of the hospital to a quarantine place. So that is another
What
thing.
about beds? Dr. Sharma, sorry, I'll interrupt here. What about the bed spacing and division of COVID suspect and COVID patient, or you will keep only COVID patients?
Yes, earlier, as I told, that basically because, as you know, that we started having people from the airport. So people were coming when they are positive or suspect, and we were asked to put them into a quarantine. So we were accepting. Then came the Nizamuddin episode. So whatever the people has been given to us, we have put them there. Then they were tested. Some of them came positive, and some of them was negative, but still suspected. So we were having. Now we have started, releasing those patients who are coming negative. In addition, government has said all the negative and positive who are mild and not having any, grave or severe infection, so they can be shifted to a place outside the hospital. So they will be giving us some hotel or some, place where they can be housed, and we will be having a mentoring over them, and our clinician will be there, going there in the morning and evening.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dr. Dhruv, you want to add something before I ask you the next question?
You see, sir, basically organization he has talked about, and I wish him good luck, Dr. Sherwal. But the biggest challenge is to get your resources, and resources, they have been lucky to sitting in the capital, got it, one. And probably that is why we are struggling in Haryana to get quite a few things. That's in a lighter vein, one. Second, which is very important, is it's not only the resource, the most challenging is your human resource, how you're managing it. That is the second component. Third, which is there is, we are all talking about ventilators and all. What I've started realizing it, even the oxygen, your cylinders, oxygen regulators, we are having a challenge. Similarly, you're getting PP is a challenge. Therefore, when you are preparing it, there are three different areas which are there. Preparation, A, then putting that thing into activation, And one of the most important things, we are all talking about the big things. The most challenging part in preparing your staff in terms of additional thing is the infection control practices. That probably you need to have an attitudinal change. So there are different components of it. And then you have to see how you can coordinate between them, because you need at any point of time to see to it that people fall in line, they listen to it, and the people who are most difficult to listen or to agree with you are the doctors. Nurses, they listen to you. Paramedic staff, they listen to you. Every day they will come up with a new question. And what my challenge, which I am finding in the preparation is the consultants, not the residents. They are trying to get it. So these are the various aspects. There is not the multiple spoken wheels, that there are multiple facets which are there.
So my next question is to all of you, especially to Dr. Joseph, that ultimately, life has to go on. 15 days from now, 1 month from now, the COVID is probably will be there at whatever pace. So how are you managing staff and equipment in ICU for managing COVID patients without compromising care to other patients? Dr. Joseph, would you like to respond to that? She's not there. Nitin, can I ask you that? Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I missed half of that question. My connection cut out for a second.
Okay. So the question is, how are you managing the equipment and the staff, which you already said in ICU, for managing COVID patient without compromising care to the other patients who require intensive care?
Okay. So we are very lucky in this instance, in that we have 3 ICUs. We have designated one of those ICUs as a non-COVID area. So all our non-COVID patients go to that ICU. So that has about 30 beds. And then we've got about 100 odd beds for our COVID patients. So we've essentially, what we've done is, so for instance, we had 4 ultrasound machines. We've put 1 in the non-COVID area, 3 in the COVID area. We have 3 video laryngoscopes. 1 goes in the non-COVID area, 2 go in the COVID area.
Okay.
Yeah. So we've been lucky.
Dhruv?
Yes.
Dr. Dhruv, Dr. Joseph?
Yes, sir. As Dr. Nitin mentioned, we also have our intensive care units separated out. We do have the luxury of having about 7 intensive care units. So we have designated 2 for the COVID patients and the others are for non-COVID patients and emergencies. Similarly, theaters, we have actually designated theaters for COVID. So we have converted actually the positive pressure theaters now into negative pressure, which is, we really had to work from the engineering side to convert most of these areas to fit the requirement. And similarly, the wards as well. We have tried and kept those COVID wards in specific floors and also specific blocks, so that the patient care in other areas are not affected, because our patient load is quite huge. At the moment, we are running only with about, let's say, 20% capacity with this lockdown. And with emergencies, it's almost 20% that's getting filled. So we have backup for everything. Like MRI, we have 4 machines. CT, we have kept 1 specific for the COVID management. And every equipment is kept like that, specific to COVID and non-COVID.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Now we are coming to the therapeutic pharmacotherapy part of it. This is the second last part of our discussion. So I first come to Dr. Ashit. Dr. Ashit Hegde.
Yes. Yes, Dr.
Ashit, what is your opinion about hydroxychloroquine?
No, I mean, the safe answer is there is no yet conclusive evidence for or against hydroxychloroquine, but it makes some sense, at least a prophylaxis, because I mean, even in MBBS, we learned that chloroquine prevents receptor-mediated endocytosis. Therefore, clearly, chloroquine might interfere with the the uptake of the virus by the pulmonary cell. So I think definitely there is some role in prophylaxis. As far as treatment goes, the so-called effect is supposed to be because of its mild anti-inflammatory effect. Now, if I had to use something for anti-inflammatory action, probably I would just go ahead and use a steroid. I'm not very sure about, if I had to use hydroxychloroquine.
We'll come to Brijesh.
So I would more for prophylaxis rather than for treatment. But that's what I was curious to know, why Dr. Goel used Doxy and why Doxy specifically. And
we'll go to Brijesh. You are the only ID specialist with us now.
Doxy was used. Yeah. was
First,
used
tell us
because
about
it had,
hydroxychloroquine. Then we will talk
so the
about doxycycline.
yeah, hydroxychloroquine, we have used, and that has worked for these patients, elderly patients. And doxycycline was added because they were advising Zithromax, which has, with the combined the Zithromax
That is
and
azithromycin.
with the QT
Azithromycin.
interval, erythromycin, azithromycin, yeah. So there's a prolongation of QT interval. So we, instead of azithromycin, we added doxycycline, which has, anti-inflammatory effect, and so it has, shown good results, but there is no comparison, they're just, we started, me and our group, the three of us, in the group, they started, and that's how it worked.
Okay, I bring in Dr. Christopher here. Dr. Christopher.
I mean, I have a different perspective. I'm just trying to be objective here. The promise of the combination of chloroquine and azithromycin came from France, Marseille. They tested about 40 patients and showed in a rather uncontrolled group that the viral counts were down. And then they did 900 and odd patients. And even this time, they made the mistake of not having a control. But they showed that over 28 days, the viral counts dropped systematically downwards. The question is this: is this a natural cause of the disease? Viral counts will drop for anybody who's improving with or without treatment. And then finally, there was a study from New Mexico. Here they had a control arm. And this study, interestingly, not only did chloroquine not do better, but the chloroquine arm required more intubation than the non-chloroquine arm. So as we speak, the evidence for chloroquine has really come down. And with regard to the combination, there is enough anecdotal evidence that there is a lot of toxicity of the combination, including one death in our own country. So I would not endorse the combination of the two.
Okay. So, good. Your comments are, actually, I more agree with you than anybody else on this. My thinking, I am not supposed to give my view as a moderator, but I am giving that I am not proponent of hydroxychloroquine at all. My question to you is about antiviral drugs. Remdesivir, lopinavir, ritonavir.
Right. So interestingly, the only controlled trial of these drugs was with liponavir-ritonavir combination. That's the only controlled trial that happened in China. And unfortunately, that was a very well-conducted study, and it would have been nice to have a good result, but it did not show benefit. The other antivirals are remdesivir and what is the other one? Favipiravir. Unfortunately, for both, there is no evidence. I really hope that the existing studies, including what is that study which is looking at 5 arms, I'm not able to get the acronym. So
no problem. No problem.
Solidarity trial.
Solidarity, yeah. I really hope that the solidarity will answer these questions. But as we speak, with antivirals or with anti-inflammatory like tocilizumab, sarilizumab, with all this, at the moment, there is no evidence. There are groups that use steroids during thyroid storm. Again, there is no trial that says if you do, it is good, then not. So we are really in a stage where we do not have good evidence.
So, Dr. Brijesh Goel, you are ID specialist, and New York is hub of COVID. So, what is your opinion on antivirals? How are they using it? Are you using it there?
I don't see in our hospitals using that, But maybe in the city, I'm outside the city. But they are using these, anti-inflammatory, tocilizumab and all those,
So, Dhruv, are you there? Any opinion on antivirals? Dhruv?
Sir. Some patient came, so I had a little emergency.
Any opinion on
I was listening to both Christopher as Dr. Christopher as well as the Dr. Govil from USA. You see, sir, I have some very serious reservations. I have discussed with you also earlier. we look at it, lopinavir, ritonavir, we are starting giving these tablets when or drugs when person are too sick. If you extrapolate from MERS-CoV, and if you extrapolate from MERS-CoV as well as from the previous studies, but in the MERS-CoV, it was a retrospective study, but which was very clearly shown from South Korea that in those 24 healthcare professionals, sorry, 23 healthcare professionals, when they gave lopinavir, ritonavir along with ribavirin, which was a very heavy dose, though none of them get any infection, A. And secondly, they have shown very elegantly a significant reduction in the viral load too. The only thing is when you are starting, I extrapolated from the swine flu, is that when you started using oseltamivir, when person already had an acute lung injury or had an ARDS going into that, obviously not today mild to moderate ARDS, how many responded? Same analogy if I take it up. So the question and the crux is, if you have to use them, you have to start early. The only thing is that more than 70 to 80% people will have recovery otherwise itself. Therefore, the challenge will be, can we use them early? What are the response, A? And what is the duration of positivity of the virus 2? And can it lead to a significant log reduction or not? That is what is very important. As far as your question, favipiravir, fewer people have been done, not available in India, but off market it is available. Similarly, remdesivir, again, it's basically anti-Ebola drug. And people are talking, they were supposed to given for 10 days, 5 days, they have been given a lot of liver dysfunction and all, which has come up. Seattle people have used it. Passionate use people are, otherwise also it has been increased. But I have to, looking at in sum total, if you ask me, I will not hesitate to use lopinavir, ritonavir, and I will prefer to use it early rather than at the early stage. That means when the person starts in the second week, have a fever, and they start getting a little restless, that is the time to start it right at that point of time, if you have not started early.
So, thank you. So, Dhruv, there is a dichotomy, if you want to start on the first or the second day of illness, then you will have to give it to the whole lot of people who will not become sick. That is almost 95%. 5% require ICU care, and rest of the people go scot-free. But probably the last word has not been said. In the interest of time, I'll have to move ahead on another issue.
I just want to say only one thing, is that
Sure.
You have to look from two angles, like you look at TB. You want to look at from the patient's perspective. What you're saying is absolutely right. No difference of opinion. Second is a public health perspective. Can we reduce the duration of these viruses? Because that will reduce the duration of their infectivity. That itself will, and if we can reduce their RO, their reproductive indices from 2.5 to 1, itself will be a big thing.
Okay, all right. So now we come to some contentious means some progressive thinking. Therapies like tocilizumab and convalescent plasma. So I come to Ashit Hegde, physician. So what is your opinion on tocilizumab? I know no one has experience. Ashit, are you there?
Yes, of course I'm here. As has already been said, honestly, for any of the therapies, there really is no evidence one way or the other. Everything is experimental.
No, but the lack of evidence is not evidence to contrary.
So the situations where I might consider it, I mean, people have used it in our city, are when people have, increased, progressively rise in D-dimer, all the inflammatory markers are progressively rising. Ferritin, D-dimer, CRP, etc. is going up, high fever, and there's clearly signs of a cytokine storm. There people have tried this monoclonal antibody. Of course, the downside is that they have a high risk of secondary infection, so we need to have a really low threshold for diagnosing secondary infections. But people have used it, especially, like I said, when the markers of inflammation are IL-6 ideally should be marked, but we don't have IL-6 available in our hospital. So if I had to use it, I would go by rising in the other inflammatory markers, ferritin, CRP, and high fever, etc., and worsening gases, of course.
Can I add one point, sir?
No, yes, please come.
No, sir. Actually, what we can do is there is something called an H score where you can look for macrophage activation like syndrome. So if the H score is something more than 169, even without IL-6 or soluble CD24, then obviously we can consider starting steroid in an early stage. And if it is in a severe stage with cytopenias and all, the tocilizumab, and different doses of tocilizumab has been described starting from 80 mg to 8 mg per kg. So that's available in India also. So 8 mg per kg, something will come around 400 mg. The cost is somewhere around 30,000, but only in limited settings where we have the evidence of like MALS.
What
So,
score? Is it available, the score, Dr. Anup?
Yeah, it is available, sir. The Cipla is having the product. The 400 mg costs around 30,000.
That's okay. We can talk about it later about the availability. We are talking about the principles, but tocilizumab could also have some adverse effects also in the form of higher incidence of infections and all those things. But there's no time to go into that. Whom do I come to? I come to Dr. Christopher. What about convalescent plasma? Where do you see it?
Well, among all the treatments described, so I think there is no evidence for any of them, although they have rationality. In terms of convalescent plasma, I am interested in it because it is somewhat cost effective. It can be used in Indian patients. There is anecdotal evidence of about a series of 5 or 6 patients critical on and were on a downward slide. But when convalescent plasma was used, they turned around and recovered. I think among all the things, this seems to be most positive in terms of evidence available. And I think that the situation is ripe for us to do a randomized trial. I hope we do that in the country. The problem is if you just go on doing things, you will never know whether the drug eventually was responsible for the recovery. So really we should go into well-conducted studies to translate the understanding knowledge.
Sir, can I just add one point?
No.
Yeah.
Yes,
Sir,
please.
Only one issue with the convalescent plasma, sir. Like ideally, we have to do a neutralization antibody titer, which is actually difficult to do. You need a viral culture, and the labs like NIV Pune only may be able to do. I don't know the CMC will be able to do or not. So that will be a challenge. So what we have tried in Kerala is like we will have to get something like an ELISA titer, look at as something similar to this thing, and based on that you will have to decide. And using this apheresis technique, you can extract almost up to 15 ml per kg. That means a 60 kg person can donate up to 800 ml, and the dose is only 200 ml. So from 1 person, you can give it for almost 4 person. And at 3 points we can use. Suppose a vulnerable person is already exposed. So as a post-exposure prophylaxis, I do admit that there is no much evidence for that, but even trials are going like that. And the best way will be, as Dr. Christopher has already told, when the patient is turning into a severe phase, that is the ideal place where we have to use. Even in a severe patient, like how much effective it is, it's difficult to say.
Okay, now last question. Well, sorry, we'll have to we have to finish this. Brijesh, corticosteroids, what do you think?
We are using
corticosteroids.
We are using corticosteroids, and I think it's working.
When? At what point of time?
In the intensive care unit, not early stages.
Well, okay, Nitin,
Yeah.
are you using?
So we are using steroids in 2 different cases. So one, we are using steroids in case of circulatory shock. So if patient is in shock, as evidenced, we are using steroids. The other place we are using steroids for ARDS is only in the context of a clinical trial. So we've currently got 3 clinical trials going on. One is based around CPAP in intensive care, and the other one is based around genomics, and the third one is based around the use of chloroquine, antivirals, and steroids. So there are 3 different groups, and that is where we are using it. We don't think there is enough evidence to use steroids for the ARDS caused by COVID-19. So we are limiting its use to as we've been advised by a regulator, to only in the context of a trial.
Okay. So if I'm permitted to give my opinion, I would take, H1N1 or whatever experience we have had. Per se, I will not use steroids in this situation unless there is a other reason of critical ill like septic shock or, inability to maintain blood pressure. And by and large, in viral ARDS, it has been found to be counterproductive. But anecdotally, if you talk to a person like Meduri, he will always say steroids works for ARDS, but I don't think they work. But anyway, now the final thing is, I come to Dhruv Chaudhary. Now this is, we have talked about intensive care. Now we come to the general. And what about masks, use of masks? Dhruv, are you there?
Yeah, sir.
So your opinion, you are wearing a beautiful mask. So what is your opinion? You think you are doing the right thing?
Yeah. So you see the mask, when you are looking at it, obviously from where the droplets are coming up, they are coming from your respiratory system. Nowhere else from the droplets will come up. Therefore, it is important for us to prevent the droplet formation, aerosolization, etc. And there is enough data now that wearing mask is important. And the only contentious issue is whom to wear what. Because in the common jugglery or the common jargon, everybody wants to have an N95 mask. That's the problem. So when you look at it today, I'm quoting, starting from the simple to the complex. Simple thing, if you see, one of the colleagues has said, if you want in a general, like the government is saying that you have to go out with a mask, and we have also issued the same advisory in Haryana. You have it in the same in Delhi now. You have same in Chandigarh also. Is that people outside who are moving around, they may not need even surgical 3-ply. They simply mean they can have a good coverage, which traditionally you do it A. Second is, which is important, is that if you want to use a cloth mask, see to it that you are not able to see through the fabric. If you are not able to see through the fabric, they are good effective up to 60% or 70% or so. Because the idea is not to throw out rather than keep preventing it. Second comes the surgical. Surgical, you have 2-ply or 3-ply. Here we are recommending 3-ply because there is in between the polypropylene layers in the front and the back, you have another mesh. And we start looking at it, ideally it should have minimum 74 or 75 GSM. That is the thickness which is there. And what we are seeing is the sub-quality, substandard masks, which have actually now flooded it. So once you have that and you wear it, if your nose and your chin are covered and tight and you do a leak test so that there is no fogging, nothing, it can be effective in up to 85 to 88% of the cases. Now then you come to the another one, which is your N95 FFP2. They are nearly equal. And FFP2 is a criteria used in the Europe. It stands for filtering phase particle. And by and large, what we are finding is even if you have an N95, there are certain specifications and standards which we need to look at it. And then the next step is FFP3. You can have a KN95, different criteria. So where you must, and the N95 mask is required in the intensive care units. You are sitting in a flu clinics. You are in an emergency. Your anesthesiologist need it while intubating. Rest of the people can be comfortable with the intensive care when I say all the staff. And similarly, your sanitation staff, when it is cleaning, you need to give them all the proper gear.
All right. So I'll not take, anybody has any issue about the mask? Christopher, Anup, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I would add another side to it. You know, we are talking about our protection, personal protection. Now, when you talk about a community perspective, now very soon we are all going to release the lockdown and people are going to start mingling. To me, one of the most important community interventions to reduce transmission would be a mask. I would say...
do I understand that you are, in the interest of time, what I understood that you are a great proponent of that everybody should wear a mask.
Sir, in fact, in our flu clinic, this is one of the treatment we are giving. Prescription and one mask.
Yes.
So
I would go one step further and say, outside, in every public space, nobody should be able to walk without a mask.
That is what I say in the government of Haryana, Punjab, Delhi. Already.
Yes, sir.
Anup, you have any?
Yeah, the Kerala also we implemented it before the central this thing itself. Why?
The last question that I will take in the interest of time. There are several questions which there's no time to go. And if anybody knows, the person is asking, when will the COVID finish?
It will stay with us. Only thing is, जिस तरह सर वो पहले बोलते थे National Malaria Eradication Program. So now they say National Malaria Control Program, which is part of it. COVID भी रहेगा, हम भी रहेंगे, लेकिन सबको बराबर में रख के चलना पड़ेगा. That is how it is there till you get some amount of an immunity to it. Will like a swine flu over a period of time after doing the initial this thing. That's what my perception.
Anybody else a different view?
in Kerala, actually, the disaster management team has made a projection about this thing. So, as per their projection, at least till next 2021 April, we will have to continue with the social distancing measures and the behavioral changes, not the complete shutdown. But at least for 1 year, we will have to, the whole, people will have to see these behavioral changes and the strict social distancing.
So, Dhruv, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, the king.